I'll start in another minute or two, give people another few minutes to show up, within 5 minutes of starting time.
I see someone coming.
This is our first meeting since daylight savings.
That's right.
Makes a difference.
It really does, yeah, to enjoy the sunlight for just a bit of time. And actually, I don't know, we're right around the time, and I don't know if this has to do with it being the start of spring, I guess it does, or where we are in the start of spring, but we're right at the time where there's 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of dark. Yeah.
That's the equinox.
Well, it's the equinox, but I think it's only because we're also at a certain longitude or latitude, because it would be different if we were, yeah, so it's, right, which has been confusing to me because I don't think it's true everywhere on the first day of summer that there's the same number of hours or minutes of daylight and non-daylight.
This is my email.
No.
We have a conflict the night of April 16th, which is a Sunday night that we're planning a class. It's the same night that the Minutemen do a reenactment out here, and there's like 200 people all over the lawn.
Oh my gosh,
Oh.
what time do they do it?
They do it around 7:10.
Oh,
So I thought you might want to relocate the class or
We
change
can
the
do that,
schedule.
or we can, well, we'll talk, whatever
Yeah.
makes sense.
But I only just realized it because they called me, and I live very close, and they called me and asked if I would have a bunch of Minutemen over at my house, which is sort of a tradition
Ah.
that we do every year, and they hadn't gotten organized to do it yet today.
I didn't know
Because the
you did
next
that in
day is
Lincoln.
is the
Easter.
holiday
It's-
third.
It's the holiday, yeah, I mean, it's
the
April
holiday
19th.
weekend. It's the,
April, it's Patriots, well,
It's Patriots' Day.
yeah.
But it's always seems to, the reenactment happens the night before, and a horse runs up to that
Yeah,
house there and says, "The regulars are out." And somebody opens the window and says, "What's all this about?" You know, and this is so cute. And all the young families bring their kids to get a history lesson. It's nice.
Might be better to wait a week.
And they have a roll call on the front steps of the church.
Ah,
And they shoot their muskets off.
Wow.
That would be, make
What's the
sense.
church here at that time? Is it that old?
Yes,
What?
well, not
Not
this building, but
But
the
the
church
church.
was here,
We did the.
right, because there was no,
Probably
the town and
near
the church,
100 years.
there was no distinction before 1820 or so.
And Lincoln was incorporated in 1754 supposedly because it was too far for the farmers to get to Concord to church, because we were part of Concord.
ah. Ah.
Diana, we used to do the ride when I was a kid, and we would hide behind the stone wall, and Carrie Glass would ride. And it was, as a kid, it was exhilarating. You could hear her coming down the street for,
Yes,
for
quite
a
a-
long
she had a good voice.
distance.
So exciting.
And the horse was already foaming by the time she passed. It was extraordinary.
Our
as young
kids used to love
See
it.
there, it made a point.
Yeah.
Your neighbor Larry Zolke used to come to our
Yes,
house.
right.
He knew a lot about history,
Yeah.
and he told people about the flash in the pan, you know, that expression.
Yes.
That means that it came of nothing, and it's because the musket had to have the powder in it, and sometimes it would explode in the pan, the little round thing next to the, where you
No.
shoot,
Mhm.
instead of inside the gun to make the bullet go. And then he would shoot his gun, which kids all loved it.
Maybe we could just start, like 20 minutes late that night
Sorry.
and advertise for the, for this course for anybody wanting to come in after the reenactment, just to somehow thematically tie it in together.
Leave your guns at the door,
Yes,
or rifles.
yes. Shall we start?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. So, we're starting. Welcome or welcome back to everyone. I'm Steve Schwartzberg, and this is our second meeting of 4 to talk about Buddhism and mindfulness for everyday life, and kind of an overview of Buddhism. Just a reminder that what we're doing is kind of there's two prongs, two threads that we're following at the same time. One is actually doing some training and practice in sitting meditation, in mindfulness meditation. And the other is getting an overview of what is Buddhism, and what are some of the main concepts, and what are some ways to understand it. So last time I started to talk about the history of Buddhism and the development of it, the life of the Buddha himself, and how Buddhism has developed over the hundreds, and now more than 2,000 years since his life. I'll continue with that and then we'll move into some of the basic concepts and some of the fundamental aspects of Buddhist practice. There's many, many concepts, and so that will take us tonight, that will be us through next time as well, and then we'll figure out where we're at for the fourth session, and either continue with that or focus specifically on Buddhism and Christianity and how they can overlap, or there's lots of possibilities for what we do with the fourth session. I began last time by invoking a Tibetan tradition, which is to start a gathering by recognizing our great good fortune of being able to be here. That not to take anything for granted, just to acknowledge, right, we're all here. Individually we are functional, healthy enough, able enough that we can actually come to this to attend. We're in a setting that's allowing this to happen. We're in a country which is a very complicated country. I'm not saying anything that it's not, and yet we have the freedom, of course, to get here and speak together and practice, which is not necessarily always the case everywhere in the world. In traditional Buddhism, part of the great good fortune is also having taken a human birth. That being born in the human realm is considered the optimal realm to be born into. Now the realms, there's 6 realms. There's 2 God realms. There's the realm of humans. There's the realm of animals. This is the old cosmology of Buddhism. And there's 2 hell realms. One is just a general hell realm, and one is the realm of hungry ghosts. And hungry ghosts are ravenous and cannot be sated in any way. It's just grasping. The human realm, it's considered a great good fortune to be incarnated into the human realm with its mix of suffering and difficulty and the possibility of overcoming suffering, overcoming difficulty. So it's regarded even as a more advantageous birth to be born in the human realm than in one of the God realms. Because in the God realms, you have no motivation to leave the luxury and to leave the sensual pleasures or whatever it is that happens in the God realm, since I don't think I've been there, or if I have been there, I don't remember. But the human realm is the realm where there's the possibility of growth and movement and action. Parenthetically, we're stepping aside for a moment. I'm not actually literally going to step aside because I'm sitting already, but one could take this as the actual cosmological map that was understood at the time, as well it might have been, and one could also, of course, apply it to the world that we live in. And within our human sphere, there may be people who live in what we consider the God realms, that we've deified, or we adulate with fame and fortune and recognition, and what it's like to actually live in one of those realms also I do not know. The human realm, the hell realms, certainly human lives that that probably qualify for being in the hell realms, the realm of hungry ghosts. And the realm of animals is considered not a bad birth, but it's a realm of ignorance. This is in this conception, at least, that there's no room for improvement. There's no room for moving beyond it, that animals in this conception are to be treated with kindness and tenderness and sanctity even, but they're not moving deeper into the realms of possible awakening and possible release from the wheel of samsara. The wheel of samsara is what we're all stuck in, living one lifetime after another, just kind of moving, wandering. Samsara means wandering. Getting a little ahead of myself. That's okay. I'll circle back to that either this evening or next week. This is all still in the realm of introduction, in the way of introduction. Recapping some of what I've already spoken, Buddhism is not a monolithic entity. It's not that there is one way of being Buddhist in the world. There are people who identify as Buddhists who have pretty different practices and belief systems from one another, as one would find in Christianity or any other major religion, that what it means to call oneself a member of a religion changes person to person and perhaps congregation to congregation. And there are also people who would say that Buddhism is not a religion, a conversation we were having earlier, that many people adopt Buddhist ideas and beliefs. It's really a belief system. As it's practiced as a religion in many parts of the world and for many people, and yet it's just a belief system devoid in the necessary belief of something more or something transcendent or something higher, and certainly it can be devoid of all the structures and strictures that go along with organized religion. The original term for it would have been a marga, a path, just a way of being. And a point that I made when I first spoke forever ago, it was so long ago in the past, I guess it was 3 weeks ago, when I came to the service, which I neglected to mention last time, but I think it's important enough that I'd just like to put this back out in the framework, is that Buddhism, there's two simultaneous threads in the practice, and one is just, I will call them the wisdom practice and the compassion practice. So the wisdom practice is the cultivation of the mind and the cultivation of being with reality in a way that penetrates in and sees things more deeply and is not taken in by deceptive surfaces. So it's cultivating wisdom. It's cultivating wisdom. And in Buddhist philosophy, there's certain aspects of this wisdom that one cultivates. And so that's a powerful foundation of a Buddhist stance in the world. And it goes hand in hand with cultivating compassion, cultivating specifically kindness and loving kindness as a bedrock principle. The Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, "My religion is kindness." I've said things that contradicted that at other points, but at least at one point he said, "My religion is kindness." And that if you have one way to practice this religion, philosophy in the world, it's to practice kindness. It's to be humane. I've often thought for myself that if I had like my deepest spiritual principle, if I can hold to it, is may I be less of a jerk. May I be less of a jerk. And I don't usually use the word jerk there, but I use a more colorful word for it. And that for me, I've thought at times, it's like too much to aspire to, may I not be a jerk at all. You know, may I be completely jerk free. Like that's, maybe in another lifetime I'll get there. In this lifetime, moment by moment, interaction, may I be kinder, may I be more engaged, may I be more respectful. That's enough of a spiritual practice for me for the rest of my years. But the meditation is a lot more fun. The wisdom path I'm drawn to intellectually, and that's really more what drew me in. So as I mentioned, today we're going to, I'll recap a little more of what I spoke last time and continue with that some more, and then we'll move into some of the central concepts. And I think before doing that, this might be a good time in our time together again to do some sitting practice. And so we'll probably sit. I'll talk some for a little bit of it, and I'd like for us to engage in maybe a 10-minute sit. How does that feel to people? Feels like either a horrible stretch or too short a time.
Too short.
Too short. Well, I know, I don't know if everyone, but I know many of you attend the meditation regularly, right? So I'm happy to do 15-minute sit. Yeah, okay, that's great. That's great. So we'll include a 15-minute sit. And for those of you who thought it was too big a stretch, I promise you, you will make it through it. I promise you that at the end of the 15 minutes, you'll still be here, and it may be even surprising in delightful ways. Let me just offer some suggestions at the beginning. What we're looking for in meditating is a mix of alertness and relaxation. So the relaxation is a fundamental part of it, a deeply beneficial part of it, and it's a relaxation that's mixed as much as we can with a mental acuity and a mental clarity, to be able to watch thoughts as they arise, to be able to be with sensations as they arise, and as much as possible to be with whatever arises by noting it, by noticing it, by being with it, watching it, observing, rather than being caught in it, which we usually do over and over, countless times in the day. It's possible to think of our daily life as moving from one entrancement to the next, where we're half here and half not here. But we're kind of in a quasi-trance state, lost in thought, lost in planning, reliving conversations, caught in emotions, just hopping from one trance to another until something else pulls us out. So while we're trying to cultivate with a sitting practice, which is really practice in mindfulness, you don't even need to use the word meditation, is how to watch whatever is arising to arise. Watch it arise. If we don't poke it, if we don't get caught in it, if we can see it before we're subsumed in it, then it will linger for a little while and then move on. And as an anchor, as an aid or assistance in this organizing of our mental and bodily energies, we choose an anchor such as the breath. And so we return over and over, even if the mind wanders, which it will. Even if something comes up which will feel compelling, which it very may will. As much as we can, we come back to this moment here now, over and over with gentle persistence. Feel free to let my words in if they are useful. Feel free just to let it be background if you prefer. The mind will likely still wander. Thoughts will arise. Restlessness or sleepiness or agitation may arise. None of this is in the least a problem. The moment of seeing it is the possibility for a moment of liberation from our usual entrancement. So you may see it. Sometimes there's a technique called noting. You can make a light mental note, thinking, planning, sleepy. Happy, irritated. Just make a light mental note and come back to the breath or hearing or just the phenomenon of sitting. like to offer a few thoughts about meditation itself, and then actually it might be a good time to take questions and answers also, if there are any questions particular about meditation before continuing with the rest of the thoughts I wanted to share. So I used the term anchor, right? The breath as an anchor. There are schools of meditation or practices of meditation where you focus on the breath specifically and in minute detail over and over, and you don't deviate from this. And some people take that as their practice for a lifetime. I'm not going to get it right if I said it in the Pali, so I'm not going to try. I almost have it right in my mind. So that's and it's a very powerful way of concentrating the mind, of just coming to the breath over and over and over. And often if you sit a long meditation retreat, even if you're practicing in another style, it's encouraged to spend the first day or two in anapanasati. That's what it is. Anapanasati is just mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the breath. Now it's also possible to get grounded enough in the breath so that there's enough presence, enough collectedness of the wild mental energy, that it's enough there that you've got it as an anchor, but that you just allow your attention to go wherever it's going to go. And then you return to the breath as you need it, or as you feel like you're getting too distracted. It's like a longer leash. It's like holding the dog on a longer leash, so there can be a lot of running, but you still want to have a leash there, because it's the value of what's called choiceless awareness is that you're open to whatever arises within your body, within your field, within your mental and somatic field. It's choiceless. You're just, this is what's arising, and so you attend to it for as long as it lasts. And then you watch it linger and you watch it fade away. The challenge of choiceless awareness is that if there is no tether or no leash, then it's basically spiritual daydreaming or quasi-spiritual daydreaming, which masquerades as meditation. And you could look as beatific and beautiful and calm and tranquil as you want, and you could be doing crossword puzzles. Not that I know this from experience. So the breath can be an anchor. Anything in the body can be an anchor, right? Breath is the historical one. The sound of hearing is a wonderful anchor because it's easy to release into it. And hearing for many of us is very expansive. I have ringing in my ears, which is whatever it is. And that is often my anchor. I don't find it uncomfortable. Some people find tinnitus unpleasant. I don't find it unpleasant. It's constantly present. So often my anchor is tuning into the ringing in my ears, and just really without judgment, and just holding that and listening to the tonal changes in it and being with it, and then I'll get lost in thought and, oh right, come back to that. So anything that's going on in the body can be a reasonable anchor. And a technique that's often quite helpful, not all meditators do this and not all meditation traditions do it, but is noting. What I said noting is if you find yourself lost in thought, then you just make the mental note, oh, thinking. You're completely not interested in the content, if possible. It's not about the content. It's not about being lost in the story, in the narrative. It's like, oh, storying, narrating, reflect, whatever it is, just so you can see it, acknowledge that it's happening, and then come back to this moment, over and over. And the practice is coming back here, now, being as awake as possible in this moment as it's unfolding. Questions about meditation itself, about the practice, about anything that's in the general realm of meditative practice, anything that's you're curious about, or that I can,
Well, let me count me as a beginner and have done some efforts at meditation in the past. And I have always been encouraged to be proactive about it. In other words, try to meditate, pay attention to the breath, have a mantra or something like that, which strikes me as very different from what we just did,
yes.
which I would call passive. By contrast, I relaxed and I then paid attention to what came to me rather than me causing it. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to
I'll
comment
add to
on that.
But I don't know whether, despite my best efforts when I was making them, I ever did meditate, got into that state. So please, your
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah. The word meditation is a multifaceted, multi-used word in many different ways, so that I don't think there is an official definition of what meditation is or should be. There are, even within Buddhism, there are tremendously different approaches to meditation. Now, some of them very specifically focus on mantra, and mantra is the repetition of a word or a sound over and over, and so you use mantra. And the intention of mantra mostly is to, again, kind of bind the mind. It's like knitting. It's giving the mind something to do. So you're using mantra to get there over and over. Now, some meditation traditions, the mantra itself, the sounds, are meant to create different phenomena in the body. It's not just about arriving here. It's to create different states of consciousness in the mind. Same with visualizations, right? In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a lot of use of visualization, and that's the focus of meditation. And it could also be chanting. Chanting is a way to focus the mind and be here with a concentration on the focus. In Theravadan Buddhism, here, the focus is just on being present, and specifically anchoring it in the breath, in the body. But it's not with use of mantra, and it's not with use of anything else. Now, I had, in my own history, when I was figuring out if I wanted to be a meditator and going to different places and trying different things, this was the one that spoke to me, the radical simplicity of just being with this and being with whatever arises as it arises. Any meditation practice is going to have a balance of relaxation and alertness, which are the words that I used, but also receptivity and effort. So there's times in a meditation practice that require a lot of effort. There's times of state that we try to sit somewhat, not rigidly, but there's an alertness in the body, stay present. It's going on because the mind is so, to personify the mind, it just wants to go all over. It's very, very hard to get it here now, and it's tricky and it's fast. The mind is so fast. So it's just going to pull you off in different directions. So you want alertness to stay. It's like sometimes the image is used of staying at the gate. You're staying at the gate of the senses. You're staying at the gate of thinking. You're standing at the gate of listening. So you're not being pulled in. So you want that alertness no matter what. But it's also, there can be a beautiful receptivity to it. Because there's a tremendous emphasis on not doing. It's not about doing anything. It's just receiving. And it can have a quality of passivity. I would think of it as more of a quality of receptivity rather than passivity. Because I don't find it passive, but I can find it receptive. The difference in language even, for example, between follow your breath and breathe and receive your breath. You can even take it in poetic directions, allow yourself to be breathed. Gets into tricky things about who the I is in there that's watching any of this. These are all different flavors within meditation. And even though I will use the word meditation often, more precisely, when I'm using it and what I'm meaning to say, even though I don't always say it, is this is practice in mindfulness. This is mindfulness training. The sitting meditation is actually, it's working with a mind. It's trying to train a mind the way that you would train a puppy, let's say, with this beautiful, wild life energy, and you want puppies to be trained, not to dampen down their energy, but to corral it. We're moving into horses here, not dogs. But so, the other thought I had in response to your question is that the discipline really comes not so much in what happens once you get onto the chair or the cushion, but in getting there, and actually fighting the resistance and fighting all the in my family tradition we would call mishigas. Mishigas is a Yiddish word meaning nonsense, nonsense, all the busyness, craziness with a small c, fighting all the stuff to get there. I've read a book about writing, and it said like what a real writer knows is that the hard part is getting to yourself to the desk every day and to the keyboard. And once you're there, then whatever happens, happens. It's the same with meditation. There's effort we can put in, there's grace, there's developing skill, but it's like what's going to happen is going to happen if you can get yourself to the chair. Your responsibility is to get yourself to the chair, if possible. And then that's so much of the practice right there is just finding the place to do that and overcoming our resistance to it.
Helpful. I'll add to just my own observation. I, and probably everyone else in the room, comes with a kind of Western mindset, which is to accomplish and to control and to get things done. And so when you use this mindfulness approach of becoming alert and letting what's going to happen, you're doing exactly the opposite of what we have all been culturally conditioned to do. And I find that very refreshing, even in this little short session.
Radical. It's potentially radical. There is no goal. That's how I invite you to embrace this. Now, and it's paradoxical, because we know that meditation is beneficial in all these ways, because Western science and Western psychology have gotten so interested in it with a Western mind that we study it and we categorize it and we measure it and we compare it, so we know, which is great, of course, it's great. We know all these benefits. And paradoxically, at the same time, the deeper invitation is to enter it with no expectation. Enter it with no agenda, no objective. There's no place to go. There's no place to get to. There's no destination with it. This is part of what drew me into it. It was so radically subversive. Like, oh, I'm just going to do it, and I don't know if I'm doing it right or not. And how does one know that? And just surrendering into there's no goal. There's no goal with it, and there is, and there's not. So, because once you get caught into the, am I doing this right? How far advanced am I? Am I doing it better than, oh, she looked really good. She was smiling, she seemed calm, Then it's, gets even more dangerous when you start practicing for a while and then you think you're getting good at it. Then it gets even trickier. Then there's like, oh, look at me. I'm a good meditator, Oh, this was a great sit. This was a great sit. And mostly what we mean when it's a great sit is, oh, I felt peaceful. I had 4 seconds of quiet. I had 4 seconds of oh, look at me, I just got quiet. Isn't that, wait, where you go? Ram Dass used to tell this wonderful story. It's in one of his books that he back in the 70s, I think it was his second book, which was called The Only Dance There Is. This is after he became like a superstar with Be Here Now, which is a brilliant book. And he talks about leading a meditation group in New York City, and the meditators, this studio, I think a yoga studio where they were sitting, happened to be next to a fire station, or above, it must have been next to a fire station. And the meditators would get irritated when there was a fire, and the fire trucks had to leave because it was puncturing their peace. Because we all desire the beautiful tranquility of the meditation, and it was, oh, these fire trucks, it's like such a loss of perspective, such a human, understandable loss of perspective. So we're doing this to attain peace, we're doing this for peace. Peace is definitely possible, and moment by moment, a greater peace is possible, and as soon as we prioritize that, as opposed to just being with whatever, then we're on a trickier path. Thank you. Is there another question or comment? Please.
I wondered if you could say more about how at the beginning of a retreat, sometimes it's suggested that you really focus on the breath or the word in a very disciplined way. Because at the end of May, I'm going on a week-long meditation retreat, and I haven't done this in, I don't know, like 5 years or 6 years. And when I went before, a bunch of times, I always had a more well-established practice. My practice is a little rusty at this point. So I'm not worried about it, but when you said that, I thought, a tip. Okay, this is good.
Yeah. And may I ask, in what tradition will you be sitting this meditation retreat?
Centering prayer.
Okay, so I know of it, but I'm less familiar with it. I can speak from my experience. No matter what you do, the first day or two of a retreat are challenging. No matter what you do, it's challenging to make the switch from our usual life to the lack of stimulation and the lack of distraction and the lack of freedom to do what we want when we want. For a few minutes it can feel really wonderful and really delicious, and you can feel very grateful you're here, and then it's either boredom or restlessness or tiredness or something or agitation that often creeps in. The first day or two can be a rough go. What makes sense to me, what I've been taught, and what makes sense to me from the teachers that I've worked with and the different settings that I've been in, is the focus on the breath, which can be tricky at first, not for 15 minutes, but for hour after hour after hour. The focus on the breath, the mind will feel, it'll feel like you haven't been to the gym for a long time. So it'll be a stretch, but that's and not in a militaristic way, by the way, not in a harsh way, but in a gentle, nudging, persistent way of coming back to it over and over, is going to gives me and will give one, I think, the foundation to, it's the best way into a foundation again. So certainly in many Buddhist retreats that I know of in different traditions, even if they're not doing the breath the entire time, the first few days are be with the breath, be with the breath, be with the breath. It's going to give the mind something to focus on. It's an experiment, though. You'll see if it works or not. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Great that you're doing a retreat. So. Okay. So now that I'll move on and talk about other things, because this was supposed to be X number of minutes, and it was 2X plus 6 number of minutes. Just to reiterate some of what I spoke about last time. This is all mixed together. So, but I talked some about the history of Buddhism, the Buddha as an actual person, which seems very reasonable to assume that there was an actual person, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived probably in the 5th or 6th century before Christ, maybe earlier, maybe later, had his experiences of personal awakening, and became a teacher and taught for probably 45 years, trained monks and nuns into his style, as well as had many, many lay practitioners as well. Mostly it's spoken that he started teaching at 35 and he taught until he was 80. And the work was kept alive as an oral tradition for several hundreds of years before these major new ideas and influences started coming into it from other philosophers, practitioners, thinkers, devotees, people who started expanding the Buddha's original ideas. The oldest one useful map of Buddhism is that there's 3 general schools of Buddhism: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Some people will just say that there's 2 major schools, Theravada and Mahayana, and that Vajrayana is a subset of Mahayana. Mahayana means great wheel, or the great turning of the wheel, and that's many new philosophical ideas that came into Buddhism starting around the year 100 or 200 after Christ, and going on developing for the next many hundreds of years. By that point, Buddhism was dying out in India, but was starting to travel and flourish in other places where it mingled with the native practices and religions and pathways and philosophies that were extant there. So when it got to Tibet, for example, it mixed with the Bon religion, B-O-N, and developed flavors in that way. When it traveled to Japan and China and Korea, it mixed with Confucianism, and it mixed with Taoism in particular, and started developing flavors there in a different way, and then just building on itself. Those would all be considered Mahayana aspects of Buddhism. The oldest, the practice that I am grounded in is, in America we call it the Insight lineage. It's grounded in Theravadan Buddhism that comes from Thailand and Burma in particular. The Pali Canon, Pali is the language of the oldest Buddhist writings, and the Pali Canon is kind of the core teachings of Theravadan Buddhism. Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist texts would be written in many different languages, in the native languages of the countries where they're at, and could be very, very different from one another. And I think I started talking some about also some of the concepts that Theravadan, that Mahayana Buddhism started bringing in, introducing into Buddhism, all of which is there in the original text, but kind of it's a difference of emphasis and it's a difference of perspective. Actually, some of it went in radically new directions. So one of the great developments of Mahayana Buddhism was the idea of the bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is a being who has attained the level of awareness and insight that is considered awakened, but chooses to take rebirth and chooses to stay in the human realm out of altruism for healing suffering throughout for healing all suffering. It actually doesn't mean staying in the human realm. There are bodhisattvas who get elevated into a realm of celestial beings, but they're still they're not ultimately liberated. Ultimately liberated means there's no more rebirth, and there's no more coming back in any form at all. Could do a whole hour and a half just on that, but I'm going to just glide right over that for now. So in Theravadan Buddhism, there was the idea certainly of awakening, an awakened being. It was called an arhat, and an arhat was the culmination of exquisite practice and wisdom and compassion mixed together. A bodhisattva was a new flavor of this, and particularly a flavor that took in this core idea of altruism, that I will delay my own awakening. I will defer it as long as there is still suffering in the world, in the worlds, any realm. There's not just the human realm, there's the realms I mentioned, and there's also spirit realms, and depending on your belief system. Harkening back to an earlier point that I made, is the Buddha's main talking point was that he said that he taught one thing, which is suffering and the end of suffering. Suffering and the end of suffering. So he wasn't interested in many other, didn't have opinions about things that were not related to that. That's where the gist was. I think we ended up kind of at the time where I didn't quite have enough time to go into Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. I'd like to speak to those just for a few minutes. So Tibetan Buddhism, Tibet is one of the places where Buddhism flourished in the world, and is flourishing in the world now. It's flourishing in the West now. Tibetan teachers started coming to the West probably, there might have been teachers before the 1960s, but 1960s I'd say was when Tibetan Buddhism started having more of an impact in the West. Chogyam Trungpa, who was a Tibetan teacher, came and founded Naropa University here. Maybe this is in the 1950s, I think it was the 60s though, something around that time. And had very famous students, and people got really drawn to his teachings. And so Allen Ginsberg and probably Jack Kerouac, except Kerouac was earlier. Let's say I'm going to place it at the mid-20th century and hedge my bets that way. And other Tibetan teachers started coming as well. Tibetan Buddhism has a flavor of, the Dalai Lama comes from one of the Tibetan lineages. There's 4 primary Tibetan lineages, all of which are quite friendly with one another. I think there's difference in emphases and there's difference in practices, but I don't think they would find major disagreements in the 4 primary Tibetan schools. Tibetan Buddhism, I think I mentioned this last time we were together, kind of has a flavor of high church. It's theatrical, there's lots of pomp. There's incense and smoke and horns and smaller horns and big horns and fabulous costumes and hats, the yellow hats or the red hats. And sometimes there's different schools of Buddhism are, in Tibetan Buddhism, are even known by the colors of their hats. And then beautiful, arcane, complicated philosophical ideas about the cosmos and about practice. So really, really intellectually very, very rich and detailed, some of which is fascinating and some of which is akin to how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin, taking things that may or may not be real in a very concretized way and looking at that, giving that a lot of solidity and a lot of reifying it. Tibetan Buddhist art is very detailed, very colorful, lots of bodhisattvas, lots of great beings, and complicated practices. And some of the practices mix with the Bon tradition, the Bon tradition, that involve more of an animistic and more of a magical, maybe, base. So it has a lot of flavor to it, a lot of texture to it. Zen Buddhism, when it went to China and Japan and Korea, took on very different flavors. And so Zen Buddhism really took on a great deal of Taoism, which was a nature-based philosophy and a way of being in harmony with things in daily life, as well as Confucianism, which had my understanding is Zen embraced some aspects of Confucianism and rejected others. What it embraced was a very powerful belief in the role of ancestors and ancestor worship and ancestor devotion. Confucianism was also more culturally rigid than Buddhism was. So Buddhism rejected a lot of the Confucian idea of designated roles and the role of women and the role based on class and hierarchy in society. Buddhism was more democratizing and more open to everyone. Some of the ideas that developed in Buddhism, and again, all of these ideas would be shared in all of the lineages, but with different different emphases. In Zen, there's more of an idea of embracing, I'm slowly going because I want to make sure I get this just right as I'm saying it. Here we are. In Zen, there's more of an emphasis on non-duality and a non-conceptual understanding of truth. So Zen took it in some ways, there's two main Zen lineages. One of them got very interested in the intellectual understanding, a non-rational but nonetheless intellectual approach to understanding reality beyond words. So the use of koan, which got mentioned earlier. A koan is a mental puzzle or riddle, which is not meant to have a clear-cut, easy answer, but meant for somebody to sit with and cogitate on to get to a deeper understanding that cannot be gotten at through ordinary words. So koan practice is one big part of one of the lineages of Zen practice. Zen also has a tremendous emphasis on simplicity and paring things down to just being as basic as possible. So for example, if you call to mind Buddhist art, the art that's very elaborate and intricate and detailed and like the sand mandalas, that's all Tibetan art. Zen art is going to be more like you start the pen here and you do a line drawing here. The calligraphy, a Zen garden, is reducing things to their very basic elements. The idea of non-duality is the idea that ultimately all separation is illusion, that all separation is a manifestation of something that's happening at this level of reality, and we can't speak about non-duality. It's not the opposite of duality, because as soon as we say it's the opposite of duality, then it's another thing. So we can only refer to it for what it's not. So okay. I think most religions and certainly there's a branch, an arm in every religion that talks about the limitation of words. In Taoism, the first line of the main book of Taoism is, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. once we're in the realm of words, of speaking something, we're not getting it at its essence. In Christianity, there's, and please, since some of you, I assume and believe and hope, know a lot more about this than I do, there's something called the via negativa, which is, it's the way of saying what all you can say is what God is not. What God is not. You cannot offer a description because any description is going to fail. It's going to be in the realm of words. In the Vedic traditions, in India, there's a phrase neti neti, which is not this, not this, not this, not that. It's often translated as. So Zen strives to, Zen has as an understanding that reality is non-conceptual, that we're not going to get there through thought, we're not going to get there through words. And I think, unless there are questions about Zen, I have more I could say about this, but I actually think I want to start talking about the conceptual stuff. Okay, so one of the ways I'd like to introduce this is in Zen, in Tibetan Buddhism, in Theravadan Buddhism, in any of it, what's a bottom line? Like, what do you need to call yourself a Buddhist? And I think we might have touched on this last week, at least not as a question that we discussed, but what does it mean to call oneself a Christian? What does it mean to call oneself a Jew? What does it mean, any of this? Who gets to define it, first of all? And are there common threads throughout all the denominations within a certain sect? So as far as I can figure, there's a few things that are core in Buddhism, regardless of how you're approaching it. And one is that there's not an origin myth. There's not a creation myth. Buddhism does not deal with how did we get here. It doesn't have a myth that's, that explains that. There's a belief in the innate goodness of humanity, of human beings. It's sometimes referred to as Buddha nature, that all human beings have what is called Buddha nature. And that just as the Buddha, at least in Theravadan Buddhism, was an ordinary person who awoke, we all have this capacity within us. All of Buddhism will have a mix of how to live in the world and how to cultivate the mind. So in some ways this is a reflection of the two wings of the dove that I spoke earlier, that there's a wisdom practice and there's a compassion practice. In Theravadan Buddhism, there's Sila Bhavana. So in Theravadan Buddhism, there's kind of a three-part structure that's sometimes talked about. And these are Pali words, and dana means generosity. Okay? So generosity related to kindness is a core principle. In Buddhist communities, in Buddhist nations, in Buddhist countries, I don't know what it's like to actually live there in a long-term way. I have visited, but an understanding of generosity and a practice of generosity is considered foundational in it. Sila is the word that we would translate most closely as ethics or values. So in each of the Buddhist traditions, languaged somewhat differently, there are core ethical beliefs that people subscribe to. Whenever I've heard them taught, the teachers go out of their way to say they're not like the Ten Commandments, and that they are not meant to be prescriptive or punitive. They're considered precepts. They're considered ethical guidelines to live by. And certainly I can talk most definitively about my lineage, the Theravadan Buddha's lineage, and I know that, I don't know how all 5 translate to the others, but in Theravadan Buddhism, there's 5 main precepts that one is asked to live by. And those 5 precepts are not to take life unnecessarily. So that can go as far as being vegetarian, and it can go even farther as to not killing mosquitoes. People draw their own line different places. But the first precept is not to take life. The second precept is to not take what is not rightfully offered to you, or to not take what is not rightfully given to you, akin to thou shalt not steal. The third precept is to not misuse sexual energy. Now again, these can be held in very severe and strong ways, or they can be held in ways where there's more fluidity. So the strong version of that is not to use sexual energy. Certainly monks and nuns take a vow of abstaining from sexual activity in Buddhism. Lay practitioners would more likely take a precept of not to use sex energy in a way that causes harm. The next precept is to use speech wisely and not to use speech in a way that causes harm. And the last precept is not to use intoxicants that cloud consciousness, or to not use intoxicants unwisely that cloud consciousness. So again, I'm looking specifically at Theravadan Buddhism, but there would be something similar in throughout the Buddhist world, that there would be some grounding in generosity and some grounding in ethics, and then bhavana would roughly translate to mental cultivation. Mental cultivation. And the way that has translated into the West is in meditation practice and mindfulness practice. So just to step aside for a moment, Westerners seem to have loved meditation. Like, meditation is thriving in the West, and the explosion of mindfulness starting 20, 25 years ago. Meditation had been around longer than that. But it's an idea that many people gravitate to, sometimes with the idea of this will be a quick fix, sometimes with the idea of I have a goal in mind that I want to attain, all of which is possible, but mostly because there's something about the Western mind, I think, that we really value meditation and value the practice of it. And culturally, it's come in without the generosity and without the ethics necessarily. So if you were living in a Buddhist country or growing up in a Buddhist setting, you don't start with meditation. You don't start with meditation. You start with the grounding in how to live in the world in a certain way. I know people who have gone to monasteries, and for the first year they don't do meditation. For the first year is service, the first year is practice, the first year is being with others. You might do a little meditation, but the deep dive into meditation, that's not considered the entry in. So this is one of the things that would in some way be throughout the Buddhist world. Another would be the interconnectedness of all things. The interconnectedness of all things, and kind of the complicated idea, and I'll return to this at some point because it's so delicious and so complicated both, is that there is no separate self, that the way that we experience a separate self is mostly illusion. And it's not that separation doesn't exist, and it's not that I know what's going on inside of you, or you know what's going on inside of me, or we know what's going on inside of each other. I mean, we have our own containers and our own histories and our own insides. But the idea of the self as we hold it is a really compelling illusion. Maybe the most compelling illusion there is that we have a separate, solid, autonomous self. I will spend more time on that in another, because it's so interesting and it's so challenging. Yeah. I'm gonna present one more idea now, since that I mentioned that, and then more questions and answers, or not answers, more questions and discussion. Answers if you have answers. So since I just mentioned the lack of a separate self, this is one of the ideas. It's certainly in Theravada Buddhism, but the Mahayana teachers and the Mahayana schools that developed really amplified this idea tremendously of non-self, that we don't have a self. And it goes back to a core Buddhist teaching from Theravada Buddhism, which is that there's 3 marks of all existence, that everything that takes birth, everything that is, has these 3 characteristics. So and that's what I'd like to end with this evening. Before I do that, I want to say that the first teaching that the Buddha offered was called the Four Noble Truths. So this was not the 3 marks of existence is not, there's lots of numbers, but the 3 marks of existence was not the first teaching. The first teaching was the Four Noble Truths, which I will also for sure amplify next time. But embedded in the Four Noble Truths is this idea that there are 3 characteristics of everything that takes birth. And the first one is impermanence. Or anicca. The second is called dukkha, and dukkha is a fascinating quality, which is, I think I spoke this already. Dukkha is sometimes translated as suffering, in one word, suffering, but it's more that it's the intrinsic inability of anything to deliver lasting happiness outside of ourselves. It's the intrinsic unsatisfactoriness of life. It's the intrinsic imperfection of the design. Now, it might be perfectly imperfect, but the analogy that's used is like it's a wheel out of balance. It's a wheel that has not been well trued. To true a wheel, right? Is that yeah. So it wobbles. If one wheel is wobbly, then the cart, the chariot, the car, anything you're driving is going to be out of balance. And there's something radical and radically freeing about the principle of dukkha. Dukkha figures very highly into the Four Noble Truths. Also, it's the core of the Four Noble Truths. So that's what I'll come back to. And the third principle of anything that's taken birth is anicca, or non-self. that there is no separate self. That self is this masterful illusion related to the idea that separation is a masterful illusion, or half-truth at best. So, these three marks of existence, impermanence, dukkha, or intrinsic unsatisfactoriness, and non-self, mark everything, are intrinsic in everything that has been created. Impermanence is the one that we can grasp most easily intellectually. Like, we kind of, at an intellectual level, I think we get that everything is impermanent, that has come into creation, that everything that has been born ceases to be. We get it intellectually. To live it in its fullness is a different matter. There are teachers who will say that if to just get impermanence, just to really understand it and to take it in is enough to awaken. Like, if we really got that everything that we can imagine, including ourselves, including any thought we have, including any ability, our own existence, it's always changing. Nothing is lasting moment to moment. Nothing is lasting in the long term. Nothing is lasting in the short term. Everything is constantly in flux. Everything is constantly in motion. Nothing is solid. If we got that, that's enough. Dukkha is the one maybe that dukkha is the most paradoxical of them. I think dukkha is the one that is the most surprising, that there can be great freedom and liberation that comes from the idea of, you know what, nothing can deliver. We all have this fantasy of what can transform us, or what can save us, or what salvation will be. We have this idea that there's an ideal out there, and if I can only find the ideal, then I'll be okay. And it's saying the perfect thing of anything doesn't exist. The perfect mate, the perfect congregation, the perfect community, the perfect government, the perfect teacher, the perfect child, the perfect anything. It doesn't exist. We have this ideal. We have, we have this we have the notion of the paragon of that's the perfect one of this, and it's an ideal. It doesn't exist, and if it does exist, Robert Mapplethorpe's beautiful exhibit of flowers, the perfect moment, impermanence. It's impermanence. He's capturing something at the moment where it's at its full blossom. It's impermanent. The two of them are very closely related. And, I'm sorry, the last one is anatta. Anatta means non-self and non-soul. No belief in a soul here. And again, that's tricky for us. That's fascinating and tricky for us. And I'll come back to all of these next time. So, 2 or 3 minutes of questions or comments or confusions or answers. Because again, if there's answers, I'm always... Please.
Well, you mentioned samsara, and I assume that Buddhism rejects the caste system of the Hindus, who also believe in samsara, but do they have the same idea of reincarnation? Like, do you get to be a hungry ghost if you've been a bad person in your next life? Do you become a hungry ghost?
So one of the fundamental teachings in Buddhism and it's is the idea of karma. Is the idea of karma, which is also this kind of complicated idea. And in its historical, traditional way, karma is the agent that determines reincarnation. So the old Buddhist teachings do believe in reincarnation. And they do believe that humans take birth over and over and over until they awaken and not to. And the aspiration is not to, because it can because of this realm being a realm that has suffering in it. Karma is a moral system, so that karma is if you not only do good things, but if you intend, some of it is intentional and some of it is actual, what you do is going to make a difference. In a reductionistic way, I think it can be used to blame people for their circumstances. It can be used to say, to come up with a too simple explanation of people are in a bad life circumstance. If people are in a bad life circumstance, it must be because they did something wrong or they acted poorly. I think to avoid that conundrum, most modern Western Buddhist teachers minimize talk about karma or talk about karma in the context of one's own lifetime, that you don't have to wait for other lifetimes to see it, that if you plant apple seeds, you'll get apple trees. You're not necessarily going to get apple trees, but you're not going to get pear trees if you plant apple seeds.
Could I interrupt? I think the karma topic is perfect. One of the consequences of karma is if people arrive late and we start 10 minutes late, then we can't end on time. And so I'd like to be the
Okay.
timekeeper and get us out on time and just point out the workings of karma.
Okay. It's a rich, complicated topic, so I'm glad to have another 2 weeks to think about a fuller answer before I come back, because it was in my notes but not so well explicated. So thank you for the question. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your engagement and your presence here once again. If there are things that you would like to hear me talk about in the remaining sessions, please feel free to let me know, so I can steer things in that direction and include that. And I'm available at this moment also for questions or comments as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, that was perfect. I was aware of the time, but I was still going to go, oh, just one more minute.
One simple question is, are we meeting in 2 weeks, or are we meeting it was first or second?
I think it's in 2 weeks, so April 2nd is 2
Yeah.
weeks from tonight.
It's
That's correct.
It's the
First,
the 19th that we have the problem with, or the
16.
the
Yeah,
16th.
we'll come up with a solution then. One option would be we could start a little bit earlier and then go out and join the facilities.
Oh,
Or we could come up with some others.
yeah.
Different day, I think.
It is a fun show.
Do you want us to help with the chairs?
Yes. That
What
sounds
day is it?
yes.
It's Sunday. We'll have a meditation group on Tuesday. So it's it'll be fine.
Okay.
Do you want us to move them in the meditations?
Sure. You know, why don't we stack them up and then, it's just simplest, 8 high. Well, I'm disappointed at the turnout, but you know what, I did what I wanted.
Okay,
So,
good.
so,
Yeah, maybe people were home watching it on TV.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got a poll, I've got a poll.